And thank you for coming to listen to the next panel discussion titled Green Shoots, Scaling GGR Rapidly, Effectively, Sustainably and Equitably. And hello, everyone over there. You don't need to see me. These are the more important people to be looking at. So just to start with, it makes sense to kind of introduce everyone that we have on the panel today. We also have two people who will be tuning in remotely. Can we see their faces? Yes, there we go. Hello, online, hello. Brilliant. So I'm going to do a very quick introduction. Everyone is highly decorated, so excuse me for taking out my notepad to give everyone's introductions. But we have, I'll do the short version as best I can. But we have Liz Bowles, who's the Associate Director for Farming and Land with the Soil Association. Liz is up here, yeah. Then we've also got Ruth Herbert, who's the Chief Exec of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association. We have Laith who's a Senior Policy Officer at the Aldersgate Group. We also have Dr. Judith Thornton, who's Project Manager for the Perennial Biomass Crops Demonstrator at Aberystwyth University. And then we've also got Sana O'Connor-Morberg, who's the lead author on Energy Transition Commission report up here. So it makes sense to start. We want to get a diverse perspective of voices, of industries in this chat today, which is why we have people from so many different, lines of business, lines of industry. And the first person that might make sense to start with, perhaps yourself, Laith. From the perspective of business, how does this relate to what we're talking about in today's session?
Yeah, so for those of you that aren't aware of the Aldersgate Group, we're a coalition of businesses, universities, and NGOs that are sort of driving towards a sustainable economy. And we have businesses essentially operating across the economy in different sectors, all the way from cement production through to food, retail, and agriculture. And ultimately, there are those are, I suppose, are good examples of businesses that come 2050 won't have been able to completely decarbonise all of their, been hit by the pollen outside, won't be able to completely decarbonise all of their operations. So they absolutely need GGRs to reach net zero. I think what the progressive industry voice is saying, though, is that rather than applying them broad scale just to any sector, we need to prioritise in the first instance decarbonisation itself. So if you can reduce your emissions through greater use of recycled content, fuel switching, resource efficiency, energy efficiency, and so on, that should be the priority first and foremost. And then really using GGRs where they have the highest abatement potential. So I think that's probably the first thing that I would want to say. Beyond that, though, I think in the last panel we had a question around, what's industry doing? Is industry moving fast enough on this? I think we'll hear from Ruth in a bit around the fact that the pipeline of CCS projects is higher than the government ambition. So what we really want to see is much greater support from government to actually create the business environment that's conducive to investment so that industry can deliver. Essentially, there is massive demand, and it's just a case of being able to unlock it.
Very nice. And Ruth, from, I guess, a carbon transport storage perspective, give us a flavour here.
Yeah, so for those who don't know about the CCSA, we represent companies working on the deployment of carbon capture, utilisation and storage, and that includes all parts of the value chain, so the carbon capture, the transport of the CO2 and the storage. And there are a number of different applications for that, obviously. That also includes people working on engineered GHG removals, so things like direct air capture, for example, with permanent storage. And as you say, I think we're going to need about 58 million tonnes of engineered GGRs by 2050. That's what the Climate Change Committee has estimated. And let's face it, it's probably, by the time we get there, maybe we'll need more. But we have got a target within the government's net zero strategy of 5 million tonnes by 2030. The challenge at the moment is that we need to get the first bits of infrastructure away as quickly as possible. There's no point capturing it and releasing it again. We need to have this CO2 transport and storage network available so that we can have permanent storage. And I know there's different types of storage being discussed today. I'm talking about geological storage, so that's the kind of tens of thousands of years sort of timeline for storing CO2. But obviously, I think the challenge at the moment with the government's working really hard to get the business models developed, to get the legislation in place. We've heard about the energy bill this week, to get all the legislation in place to run these CO2 networks. But we are still waiting for confirmation on the successful projects, capture projects that are going to connect to those clusters. So the clusters that have been selected are HyNet in the northwest and East Coast cluster in the northeast. So that's 2 of the 4 that the government committed to do before 2030. We want to know when the next 2 regions are going to be selected, so the next 2 clusters. And we also want to know, so for example, the capture competition underway at the moment, who's going to be successful there. And you know, as Laith said, the scale of demand is huge. We did a study between February and March of the industry with our members and wider stakeholders. We went to every part of the UK and talked to major emitters. And there is demand for 70 million tonnes a year of CO2 capture and storage in the UK by 2030. There are that many heavy industries that want to use that technology. And you know, as Laith said, I think abatement at the point of emissions, you know, so either avoiding emissions through electrification, if you can't, then using carbon capture and storage to remove emissions from the flue gas is by far more economic than taking it directly out of the air using direct air capture. However, we know that there are industries that will need direct air capture as well. But at the moment, in that pipeline that we found, there are huge amounts of energy from waste plant, biofuels plant, and cement that all can do GHG removals because they all have biogenic content. And if the government were to take, for example, its 6 million tonnes a year by 2030 target for industrial CCUS and bring that forward and say, actually, we want to have 6 million tonnes in the first clusters, I'm sure that within that we could get at least a megaton of engineered GGRs operational by the middle of this decade. So industry is ready and raring to go with this. All of the legislation is getting put in place, and I'm confident and hopeful that that process will be smooth through the Parliament. But it's the level of ambition and the pace that we build this at that you know, I want to see a bit more ambition, and let's go a bit sooner with that. And as you know, well, you may not know, but those technologies, those engineered GGRs can go ahead with the industrial carbon capture business model, which is available at the moment, and they're in the phase 2 competition for that. So all we need to do is allow more of those projects through at this stage, and then they can get started and we can get building some stuff. But yeah, we also want to see a business model for GGRs developed, and that one is behind the others, and I think that one is quite crucial as well for some of the other technologies that I talked about, like DAX and BECCS.
Fantastic. And that's the whole piece about, you know, registering that demand, 70 million, is really exciting. And then passing over perhaps to Judith, I guess, could you give us your take perhaps from an equitable standpoint on scaling this industry?
Yeah, so equity, it's not something I'm researching. I guess I'm sat here because I live and see and feel the equity issues with this all of the time. Live in West Wales, and you know, most of the technologies that are in the demonstrator programme are relying on land, and there's a long and very painful history of land grabbing, and who owns the land, whether the English get to flood the Welsh land, you know, whether it's power stations or wind turbines or PVs, and now it's holiday homes. So there's this really there's this real tension, there's this regional tension in terms of equity, and I think there's also a massive disequity in the emissions. Okay, so, you know, I'm slightly amused that we're hearing how hard it is to decarbonise aviation when actually 50% of the population didn't fly in a year. So it wasn't difficult for that 50%. So the actual equity in who's doing the emitting and then who has to pay for the removals is problematic. And then I think in terms of the relationship to equity and the land, you know, all these land-based technologies, all of this land is farmed and owned and tenanted and led by people who've been doing this who've been looking at this land and looking after it for generations. And we're trying to change the use of that land quite significantly, and we have to take the people who own that land with us on that journey. But we can't afford to move at the pace of the slowest. So there's a real tension between how fast we need to move and how to do that in an equitable sense.
Brilliant. And now we can turn to our online panel. Liz, maybe it would be interesting to touch on a bit more of that kind of what Judith was saying with regards to land, given your background.
Yes, absolutely. I was thinking that as Judith was speaking. So I lead the work that the Soil Association does with all farmers, whether organic or not. And we're committed at the Soil Association to supporting that transition to agroecological farming systems over the next decade. But alongside that, I'm also a director of the Farm Carbon Toolkit, which is one of the 3 most commonly used farm carbon calculators in the UK at the moment. And I just wanted to just really, following on from what Judith has said about this whole aspect of farmers and land. And I think much is made of the ability to sequester carbon into soils and also into biomass on land. And that's clearly what's driving the land grab in many parts of the country. And I absolutely concur with Judith that farmers are very unhappy about this, primarily, I think, because it really will break up how agriculture works. It will make it very much more difficult where some diseconomies of scale come in for those that are left. But I think it's worth noting within all of this that, I mean, in your introduction, Tom, you made the point that agriculture and aviation are unlikely to be able to completely offset their own emissions. And that's absolutely true for agriculture, because producing food does inevitably produce some emissions. Having said that, farmers are beginning to understand how they can reduce those emissions, and increasingly they're understanding that they need to reduce emissions rather than simply sequester carbon somewhere and then sell it as an offset. In fact, this whole sort of voluntary carbon offset market, last year it was really, really hot. Loads of farmers thinking they could make a fortune from selling those offsets. And actually, interestingly, a lot of farmers who are farming permanent grassland, so livestock farmers, like the farmers in Wales, had thought they could be paid for carbon offsets, even though they probably already stored close to the maximum of carbon in their soils, unless they were to start planting trees. And I think there's a real sort of issue here for agriculture, that there will be potentially more opportunity for those farmers who've actually reduced the carbon in their soils to make more money out of selling carbon offsets in the future. But the one thing I really wanted to dwell on for this conference was this, really, that for farmers, in my experience, other than a small minority, the vast majority of farmers are somewhat perplexed about all the conversations about how to sequester carbon into soils, in as much as they don't know whether they should start planting trees now, because at the moment they're concerned that if they start doing things and then they have to baseline their position in 3 years' time, probably the majority of the carbon will already have been captured and they won't have been paid for that carbon capture. So there's a real sort of thirst for information and knowledge out there. And if you think about it, unlike the majority of industry where there's very large players, in the agricultural sector, it's made up of tens of thousands of SMEs. And there's currently no real clear, consistent messages being shared with farmers on what the opportunities are and actual real information that they can trust. And I think that's a real lack at the moment in this whole space of supporting farmers to do the right thing. But they are aware of their need to reduce emissions. And over the last four months or so, with the price of nitrogen fertilizers increasing by 300%. That has focused their minds enormously, because if you think about it, some 40% of all the emissions, say from a loaf of bread, come from the manufacture and use of artificial nitrogen fertilizers, which is the sobering thought, really. And I think it's also worth mentioning to this audience that the total contribution of UK agriculture to the farm gate in terms of emissions is something like 10%. It's not, I think sometimes people feel it's a massive number, but that's the number to the farm gate. Significantly more emissions are incurred through transport, processing, and onward transport for food.
Thank you for those insights, Liz. That was really, really interesting, actually, about that 10% piece. And just don't forget, everyone in the audience here and online, you can scan the QR code on the Slido screens on the left and right and ask questions, because we're about to go to a Q&A. Whilst you think of some of your questions, we'd also love to ask for Shana for her piece, or perhaps some of her insights that she's taken out from the recent report for the Energy Transition Commission, which she was leading on.
Hello, thank you very much for having me. I have stepped in somewhat last minute for Kettleborough, who is the Director of the Energy Transitions Commission. And I am speaking here today in my former role as the lead of carbon dioxide removals for the Energy Transitions Commission. The Energy Transitions Commission is a global coalition of leaders from across the energy landscape, committed to achieving net zero emissions by mid-century towards reaching a goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I think the Energy Transitions Commission comes into the story from a perspective that ambitious decarbonisation by mid-century is technically and economically possible. So the Energy Transition Commission, therefore the ETC, wanted to understand if such ambitious action is feasible, and we tend to be very bullish on that story, then what is the role for carbon dioxide removals in adjacent to that? And this report that we did found that although all sectors of the economy must rapidly decarbonise over the next decade, and we do think that's technically economically feasible, and we need to cut emissions close to net zero by mid-century, but even in such an ambitious decarbonisation scenario, greenhouse gas emissions reductions will be needed because we are likely to overshoot the carbon budget required to limit temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius regardless. Our report had a series of sort of key messages, which really drew on that insight and really understanding the role of these emissions in adjacent to rapid decarbonisation, because I think that's a very pertinent discussion. But first, we found that to avoid overshooting the carbon budget, the world really will need around 70 to 225 gigatons of carbon dioxide removals globally between now and 2050 in order to keep 1.5 degrees alive. And even more will be required if the slower the progress on emissions reductions. Secondly, we found that a portfolio approach to carbon dioxide removal solutions is undoubtedly going to be needed, complementing nature-based approaches, looking at soils and agriculture, as Liz has just been talking about, but in adjacent to hybrid and more technical engineered solutions as these technologically come online later towards the second half of the century. This portfolio will therefore likely shift focus over time from nature-based solutions, which are available now and at lower costs, towards these more engineered approaches. But it's important for us to stress that this isn't an either or equation. All of these solutions will be needed to address this carbon removal or this carbon budget overshoot gap that we talk about. Thirdly, we just talked about how managing risks to permanence and delivery of these removals at scale will require really robust monitoring and verification systems and secure finance. So this is where the role of the regulators really begins to step in. And as some of my panelists have mentioned earlier, these projects are beginning to be realized, but we really need the regulation to be able to make them happen at pace that is needed. Fourth, we found that removals will need to be paid for via a combination of corporate and governmental efforts. The voluntary carbon market, for example, will not be enough on its own. And we're likely to see at least a $200 billion funding gap per year to scale removals from 2030, from close to zero by 2030, from close to zero today. Finally, we argue that to deliver the carbon dioxide removal necessary at scale, key policy and corporate actions must be supported as early as today in the 2020s. And our report goes into further detail on 9 actions that might be needed to kickstart this movement. But we really stress the importance of business and industry working with governments, because it is not one individual sector that's really going to deliver this to keep 1.5 degrees alive.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Shana, for that summary of the report that you guys worked on. And I think gives a really good context for, I guess, where we need to get to, or some of the kind of approaches that we need to take, whether it's a portfolio or such else. I did it last time, I did it again. For anyone that's curious as to who I am and what the hell I'm doing up here next to all these people, my name is Tom, and I am a co-host of a podcast for carbon removal, aptly named The Carbon Removal Show. I had no context or background in carbon removal before starting that show about a year and a half ago, and so we've been on a really fascinating journey of kind of being curious climate enthusiasts that have really kind of had the pleasure of interviewing experts and real kind of thought leaders, such as our esteemed panel here. So that's, yeah, for anyone that's wondering what I'm doing up here. Now we're going to turn to some questions that our audience has been submitting. And perhaps on something that you already mentioned, Ruth, there's a question from Ashley, and perhaps Laith, Ruth, you might be able to touch on this a bit more. Is our 6 million tonnes per year target by 2030 and I think 100 million tonnes of removal per year by 2050 ambitious enough, given what you've just mentioned, Ruth, and perhaps the global capacity that we might have?
So I think just to clarify these different targets, because I think I'm also one of those people that gets stuck in all the targets sometimes, there's so many. So the 6 million tonnes by 2030 I referred to was a sort of interim target for CO2 capture from industrial sources. There were a number of other interim 2030 targets in the net zero strategy, including 5 gigawatts of hydrogen, which recently got increased to 10 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen, and that can be CCUS enabled hydrogen, blue hydrogen or green hydrogen. So there were a number of these kind of targets. They also said they wanted to have CCUS on 1 or 2 gas-fired power stations with CCUS. So there were a number of these interim 2030 targets, and I really applaud having near-term targets, because if they're all too far away, then you're not going to deliver them. But I think what's probably slightly, what we focused on was the 2035 target for CCS, which was over 50 million tonnes a year being captured and stored. And again, that was from a number of different sources. For GGRs, engineered GGRs, so direct air capture, BECCS, bioenergy with CCS and so forth, the 2030 target was 5 million tonnes and the 2051 was 58 million tonnes, and this is just for the UK. Globally, obviously, it's much bigger, and we heard earlier. I think all of these targets we just have to take them very seriously and aim to achieve them as soon as possible. I don't doubt, as we keep getting increasing reports every year from the IPCC, that we're going to probably need to do more. We're probably going to find we're going to have to go further. And so let's not wait. Let's not take a sort of slow curve up to these targets. My view would be that since we've come forward and we've discovered this demand that there is in the industrial regions. I mean, the good thing about starting in the industrial regions is that the industrial regions of the UK are former sort of industrial heartlands, as the government likes to call them. They have about 50% of industrial emissions there. So, and it's a huge contribution to the country's emissions. So you can start there, and these are regions with really concentrated lots of businesses, cement, manufacturing, energy from waste, lots of different steel, other things, and you can kind of with quite a small network, I would say, of CO2 pipelines, and they're close to the coast where the subsea storage is. You can actually get an awful lot of emissions quite efficiently, and you're not perhaps encroaching at all on farms and things. So, let's do the low-hanging fruit first, I would say. But I fully agree, we need everything. And when you look across sort of how you're going to decarbonise farming and other areas, whether that's going to be done, the same debate is had within aviation. Is that going to be done by the sector itself, or is it going to use an offset and use something like direct air capture and storage under the sea? I don't know how these sectors are going to evolve, but I would say we need to be looking at everything, and we definitely need to be getting some of everything done first, and then looking at the learning from that and moving as quickly as possible to these targets. But I would bring forward the 6 million tonne one to the middle of the decade. I would say we can definitely build a megaton of engineered GGRs by the middle of the decade if we just take forward more of those energy from waste, cement and biofuels with CCS projects that are already there in the government. They've already submitted all their applications into the government, and they're just waiting for a decision. So if we got that decision, we could move quicker, I think.
Laith?
So I think, I won't add, I agree with everything that Ruth just said, and I wouldn't add too much on targets themselves. I think whenever I talk about ambition, I think there's one thing around targets and commitments. The other side of the ambition that we need, and that I would say I'd be calling for when making those kinds of statements, would be for policy delivery itself. So, the wider supportive policy framework that actually then can deliver on those targets. So, I noticed another question that's popped up around how can we make sure that greenhouse gas removals don't slow down actual decarbonisation activities. Funnily enough, I think one of the things that will support further rollout of greenhouse gas removal technologies is one of the things that will also make sure that we're not slowing down abatement elsewhere. So, ultimately that's about giving a really clear signal to where we're going to be using these technologies. And I think, so I sometimes hear the phrase license to operate. I think this is what I was trying to get at earlier when talking about actually making sure that we use GGRs where they have the highest abatement potential. If we have clear sectoral pathways for decarbonisation, I work primarily on industrial decarbonisation, so most of my conversations are around electrification, hydrogen rollout, fuel switching, recycled material content, and so on. But one thing that different sectors compete for is all of those technologies, and understanding, to what extent each of them will actually be using, one of those. And so, similarly, applying that to something like CCS, where there's a really clear idea of where this is going to be used and for what purpose, not only gives a great signal to investors around, where their money will be going and creating that signal to actually invest in the tech. It gives, that kind of signal elsewhere that's, not going to be an option, or, you can't just simply continue with business as usual. I think pulling this all the way back to the question around ambition, there's a few measures that I suppose could be put in place to actually then deliver on ambitious targets. So, ultimately it doesn't really matter how ambitious your target is if you're not backing it up with the delivery. And then just one last thing to add to that point, I suppose, would be making sure that we have ambitious carbon price, because that's what's going to make carbon removals cost effective. If it becomes, cheaper to remove a ton of CO2 than emit it in the first place, then there's your clear business case for doing so.
That's a really good point. And perhaps then taking it back to the land aspect, Judith, Liz, we've got a question in from Navraj asking about land prices and how they perhaps have exploded in recent times off the back of people or organisations looking to kind of do that land grab to be able to sequester their own emissions or offset their own emissions. Does this undermine the scaling of land-based solutions in the timescales that we need?
Yes, I mean it's really problematic, the increase in land prices, because that is in Mid Wales it is chasing families off the land. Farmers are selling up, and they're at the point where they're like, they can't see a future for themselves in this industry, and the prices they're being offered for land are high. I guess one of the you know, one of the good things in agriculture and decarbonisation is that agriculture, because the farmers have the land, they are in a position to offset their own emissions. So we need to be quite clear with agriculture. You know, agriculture's got a net zero by 2040 target, and you know there's clear agricultural emissions, and farmers are going to need to be offsetting their own emissions before they start selling offsets to other people. So I think we need that agricultural piece to farmers to accelerate their own individual progress before they can then, you know, think about selling those offsets to other people. But if they find it too difficult, then yeah, they will sell up, and we'll have a national forest.
Liz?
Yeah, to add to that, I mean, I think a bit about making it more difficult for scaling is true, because as land gets sold, well, more for agriculture actually, because as land gets sold for trees, that means that all the infrastructure for agriculture is stretched over less area, and therefore it will become less economic. But I think the really key point in all of this is this, that at the moment, it's the cheapest option for corporations to buy land and plant trees rather than reduce their emissions. And I think that the problem with all of this is that by planting trees, it's not, yes, it's sequestering carbon, but it's not reducing those emissions. And it's emissions reduction that is key over the next decade. And I think, therefore, for businesses to see this as the easiest, cheapest option is a false dichotomy. And if then we look at agriculture itself, it does have a huge potential, not only, as you mentioned, to sequester carbon into soils and into biomass, but actually also to reduce its own emissions. The Soil Association a year ago now produced a report looking into the impacts if we were to transition agriculture in the UK into agroecological farming systems. And we found that we could reduce the overall emissions from agriculture by some 40%. And that's before we start looking at specific carbon sequestration elements. And that the primary reasons that would be possible would be through reducing reliance on artificial fertilizers and also somewhat reducing livestock numbers. But in order for that transition to feed us all effectively, we would have to look at diet change, reducing the amount of food we waste, and also at sort of land use in the UK. But it's perfectly possible. And I think that's a really important sort of thing for everybody to be thinking about. And certainly for farmers themselves, right now, if they were to sell the carbon they can sequester, that turns them into high carbon producers potentially, unless they've got to net zero before they start sequestering carbon to sell to others. And I think that's not really being considered. And there's a real role here for the whole supply chain of agriculture to think jointly about how it can work together to reduce emissions.
Any thoughts from anybody else on that kind of land piece before we go into another question?
Not on the land piece, but I do think this point about making sure things are additional and that they're monitored and auditable is so crucial, especially as we see how the sort of voluntary market's taking off. It's really, really important. I mean, the good thing, I guess, about taking CO2 directly from where it's emitted in heavy industry and stuff is we can actually put a meter on it, on the pipe, and we measure exactly what's coming out the pipe, and we measure exactly what's going into the store, and we can monitor, and we know that it's staying there for hundreds of years. I think, again, when people are using biofuels, biomass energy from waste, they already have a FMS process, fuel monitoring, sustainability process that's heavily regulated. So they already monitor precisely how much biogenic content's in there and therefore can calculate how much of this is GGRs. So I think all of that's there in industry and in the kind of CCUS and GGR, engineered GGRs that I represent. I think it's clear that there needs to be a way of having similar kind of regulation and stuff in these other sectors to make sure that we're clear it's additionality and it's, we understand exactly what CO2 reduction is happening and removals.
Nice. And on the pipeline piece, on pipes, someone's asked a question, but Leopold Schwartz-Schut, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, has asked about, I guess, when it comes to transport storage of CO2, how can the governments, UK government, I guess particularly, and business, speed up that process, given perhaps there might be some public scrutiny for I guess, growth of something like that? Any thoughts from anyone here?
I think public engagement is really, really important in this. I mean, let's be clear, a lot of these industrial regions, they've got a lot of infrastructure, port side, if you like. There's a lot of different types of pipelines and things, hydrogen, gas, and so forth. And so, I mean, this is another bit of infrastructure, and so the normal processes have to be followed. I think there is a challenge, and I heard a colleague, I worked in the wind industry for many years, and I heard a colleague at a conference recently saying about offshore wind that the most frustrating thing is, they can build an offshore wind farm in 2 years, but planning and so forth means it's taking 10 years from concept to operations. I don't want to see the same thing happening with CCUS. We clearly need this CO2 infrastructure in these industrial regions, otherwise the stuff's going to keep going into the atmosphere. So whilst I think it's very, very important that we engage local communities, and what we're seeing actually in these industrial regions is LEPs and mayors and MPs extremely proud of the opportunity to lead the transition to clean, net zero clusters, and to have clean steel and clean cement made in their constituencies. And I think there's a huge amount of pride in those regions, actually. They've always evolved and they can be part of this next transition. So I'd like to think that means they can get behind the projects and we can move them as quickly as possible. But yeah, of course, there's a big dialogue about what that means. But I think they're used to big infrastructure and change, and I think this is just another really important phase for heavy industry, I think.
Yeah, I think just one thing to add to that is that specifically when it comes to CO2 pipelines and what government can do, I think that again, with pretty much every other major decarbonisation technology, especially transport of hydrogen, you have 50% of our industrial emissions coming from industrial clusters, perhaps where this is a little bit simpler. The other 50%, especially for cement plants, that are obviously a big sector when we're having this conversation, are dispersed sites. So it is going to be really difficult to get that kind of pipeline infrastructure to them. I don't know whether we need to pursue a hub and spoke approach between clusters and dispersed sites. But exactly, yeah, so looking at road freight, shipping, rail, and on specifics about what the government can do, I think that obviously great to see all of the work on the CCS business models, but at the moment it looks like most dispersed sites are going to be ineligible because they can't show that they have a viable transport and storage solution. So in terms of tackling the issue with connecting dispersed sites to this infrastructure, as well as avoiding as much as we can do the laying down of huge pipelines that might be unpopular, working directly with dispersed sites and some of these companies to understand what kind of transport and storage solutions are available to them, particularly when it comes to sort of tube trailers and how that can fit into the business model. Because if we don't include them, then like I was saying, that's 50% of our industrial emissions that aren't going to be decarbonising at the same rate as those at industrial clusters.
We just had another question which has popped up, then it's gone, and now it's back, from Lucy, asking about MRV and ensuring that is available for perhaps farmers and I guess other slightly more decentralized, perhaps you could say, kind of approaches to carbon removal, GGR. Actually, it's a question that I had for you all. What role does, I guess, centralized greenhouse gas removal projects play versus the more decentralized, perhaps, approaches with individual farmers or biochar production, things like that? Any questions from or any thoughts from online?
Yes, I mean, certainly I should have mentioned earlier on that at the moment we've got a woodland carbon code, and we've got a peatland carbon code, which sort of sets out the rules of engagement, if you like, for the voluntary carbon market operating on those land use types. But at the moment, we don't have one for farmland. One is being developed, and it should be available next year. And I think certainly this whole space of the MRV for carbon sequestration into soils is really necessary. I mean, certainly in farmer parlance at the moment, the carbon offset market is likened to the Wild West, where the conversations over how permanent is permanent are quite often sort of quoted. And this whole idea of additionality and reversibility are critical, because on farmland, if farmers are going to carry out a practice which sequesters carbon, it's ever so easy for them to reverse that sequestration the following year, or the year after the 10 years is up, if only 10 years is required. So I think there's a real need for this. And I know that the consortium that's working on the Farmland Carbon Code is engaging with DEFRA to really sort of try and bottom out the role of government, as well as the role for other quangos or other organisations to develop this kind of verification and audit type process. Currently, there isn't any for farmland, but the recognition is there that there needs to be one.
Can I just add to that, which is that I think that we need to invest in monitoring and verification, scaling best quality science innovation in monitoring and verification, even as much as we need to invest in these removal technologies in of themselves. Something I wanted to stress earlier, and it was linked to the earlier conversation about how do we make sure that this doesn't reduce ambition for decarbonisation, even as we look to removals to complement that, is that something that our report finds is globally, even if we take an ambitious take on scaling carbon dioxide removals from feasible solutions over the next 30 years, we will only have enough to mitigate that carbon gap to keep us on a 1.5 degree or even within a 2 degree gap if we also deliver extremely ambitious decarbonisation. There's not enough high quality supply of carbon dioxide removals, both from a land-based perspective, and it's incredibly important that we get the monitoring and verification technology and innovation and certification systems through the regulation to deliver that high quality supply. But even then, there won't be enough unless we also, from a global perspective, decarbonize extremely ambitiously. So it really cannot be seen as an alternative option. It really must be both. And I think that understanding that as part of the narrative is important. It's not enough to say, well, this offset means I'm clear. It ties into my current role. I work at an organization called Carbon Direct, and we use a science-based perspective to really try to assess how you can source high quality, high integrity carbon dioxide removal supply, both from nature and engineered solutions. And there just isn't high enough quality supply today at scale unless we establish those monitoring and verification systems and certification schemes to make sure that that is being delivered. Otherwise, we're just going to create more problems, as Judith and Liz have already referred to.
Thank you for that addition there, Shana. We've got a couple minutes left. I think we had a poll which we were meant to ask at the beginning, but I forgot to ask for that to come up. So perhaps we could ask for it now. Yes, here we go. So for anyone in the audience online, please scan the QR code and answer this question. How confident are you that the UK is going to achieve our goals to be our net zero strategy and stay on track for 2030 for 5 million tonnes of engineered removal, which I said incorrectly earlier, it's 5, not 6, and then the 30 hectares of tree planting. So yeah, answer that. Whilst that's happening, any remarks from the rest of our panel, perhaps on what they're seeing here in not confident, or any other closing points?
We forgot to ask Paul.
Yeah, there's no yeah. Anyone? Yeah, Paul? Is there a Paul in the audience? Yeah, any other remarks or thoughts from the panel?
I think it's very hard to see how we're going to be able to do 30,000 hectares a year of tree planting. You know, we're supposed to be planting, you know, if you've got a target of 5,000 and actually you only achieve 200 or 300 hectares, simply increasing the target, it makes it look good from a policy perspective, but it's a nightmare for delivery. And we don't really seem to be addressing what it is that is making us fall so far short of our existing targets before we actually scale up our targets.
I mean, I'll just repeat what I said earlier. I think we could easily do a million tonnes of engineered GGRs just in using the existing industrial carbon capture business model. You know, by the middle of the decade, assuming that the clusters go ahead on the timetable the government's working to. So that's a good start. And as per our pipeline, you know, we can easily meet the 2030 5 million tonnes as well if we continue to build out at a regular pace. And I think this is part of maybe the debate is, you know, we're just going to do a few projects here and there and then see what happens. Or are we going to commit now and say, we know we've got to meet those targets, so let's commit to a smooth trajectory of build out that gives confidence to investors. It means that people can start planning their workforce planning, their supply chain investment. You know, they can start thinking about what sites and what they need to do this on and what infrastructure you can connect to and develop that pipeline and invest in developing that pipeline. If we don't have that, it's almost the implementation strategy effectively, then all we've got is the ambition and industry trying to keep this pipeline of projects alive. But yeah, if they don't win in this year's competition, when is the next opportunity to go forward? So I think that combined with the longer term frameworks that Laith was talking about, making sure that the emissions trading scheme works effectively, that you know, that is upheld and not backtracked on, that it's extended to cover more sectors, and that we have effectively other things that are driving this, then I think, yeah, there's no reason why we can't do it. The technologies are there, the capabilities are here in the UK. We've got great offshore industry. We've got all the sort of skills for carbon capture within the chemicals industry. It's been there for many decades. So there are jobs here for our young people. If we can actually get this going quickly, then there's lots of green jobs for the future, which I think is a really important part of this as well.
Loving the optimism, and I guess we've just gone over the 1 o'clock finish time, so I think we'll wrap it there. But thank you again, everyone, for taking part and listening in online. Thank you to our online panelists, our in-person panelists, and obviously our audience here. Enjoy lunch.